The BMP-1, one of the most instantly recognizable pieces of heavy military hardware in the world, and one of its most widely used. It is often referred to as a revolutionary design, the first IFV, or infantry fighting vehicle, in the world, and a design which forced its rivals to scramble together their responses. However, like with many things, the claims of it being revolutionary are, in reality, considerably more complicated than the pop history understanding would have you believe. Before the BMP, there was the BTR-50, which entered service during the mid-50s, and about 6,000 of which would be made. This coincided with the process of significant reorganization after the Second World War that the Soviet Union undertook. The Red Army of the Second World War was, as with all armies, primarily infantry-based, and though they did have a larger tank force than most other nations, at least proportionally speaking, the Soviets were significantly under-mechanized. That would have to be changed, and the BTR-50 was the backbone of that change. The vehicle's armor was rated against small arms fire from the front and resistant to small arms fire from the other sides. Its own weapons could be either nothing, a 7.62mm machine gun, very similar to that which was carried by its dismounts, or a 14.5mm machine gun, more commonly viewed as the anti-aircraft pintle mount on Soviet tanks. Similar to the larger American armored personnel carrier designs floating around about a decade earlier, it would carry a much larger number of dismounts than is usually thought about when it comes to these vehicles. An interesting food for thought is what would have happened had the Americans and Soviets decided to pursue those larger infantry carrier designs, as opposed to moving to smaller vehicles only carrying a single squad of infantry. But this design would have some fairly significant weaknesses. It was open-topped, which, though useful for being able to cram more men into it, did mean that it could not be given NBC protection, that being nuclear, biological, and chemical. The lack of overhead protection would also mean that the dismounts were vulnerable during transport to overhead shell fragmentation. The BTR-50 PK variant, which came out in 1958, would fix these problems, but as an upgrade onto an existing design, you couldn't really retrofit proper NBC protection into this. The armor was also a problem. This was because many NATO-equivalent vehicles were armed with 50 cals. In fact, most were, which meant that if this vehicle came up against its equivalent, it would be at a severe disadvantage, as only some of them were armed with their own heavy machine guns, and most only armed with 30 cals, which would not be able to penetrate enemy armored vehicles. This would lead to the design requirements for, and pardon this pronunciation attempt, the Boyovaya Machine Piechoty, or BMP, which roughly translates as Infantry Fighting Vehicle. Its requirements would be all-around protection rated against 50 caliber fire, and 20mm fire from the front. Its own firepower had to be capable of defeating other lightly armored vehicles. These requirements would be issued in 1959 or 1960, depending on which company or design bureau you're looking at. In 1966, production would begin. As I have mentioned previously, this design would often be referred to as a revolutionary one. Armed with a 73mm 2A 28 Grom smooth-bore low-velocity gun and a 9M14 Malyutka ATGM, also known by its NATO reporting name, the AT-3 Sagar. This was the first Soviet ATGM to enter service, having only first entered service 3 years prior. Its final weapon would be the ever-ubiquitous PKT machine gun, in this case a coaxial mount. Its complement would be 8 dismounts, a much smaller number than its predecessor, but far more in line with the general trend, and being a Soviet vehicle would be produced in Soviet quantities. The USSR itself would produce 20,000, Czechoslovakia another 18,000. The People's Republic of China would produce 3,000 as their own defense industry began to spool up. As far as its revolutionary status, it certainly looks good when you compare it to the British and American vehicles. The British FV-432 entered service 3 years prior, the American M113 6 years prior, both being armored boxes, primarily armed at best with heavy machine guns, which of course the BMP was protected well against. However, there would be more adversaries than just the Americans and the British, particularly the Germans, who would field the HS-30, also known at the time as the Schützenpanzer Lang 12-3, or the infantry tank Long Type 12-3, which entered production in 1958, 8 years prior to the BMP. In fact, it would enter production before any company or design bureau had the design requirements for the BMP. All said, about 2,200 would be built, although 10,500 were planned on being built, the first 1,000 of which would be built by Leyland Motors in the UK. We'll get back to why in a moment. And as far as that designation as the Lang, that is because there was also a Schützenpanzer Kurz 11-2, or infantry tank short Type 11-2, which was effectively a reconnaissance, well, not variant, but a related design that was initially designed by the French Hotchkiss Company. About 2,000 of those would also be made, the first 1,000 made by the French. This vehicle, the HS-30 or Hispano-Suiza, after the company that designed them, would be armed with the 20mm Hispano-Suiza 820 autocannon, and its armor would be rated against 20mm fire from all directions, which made it a pretty well-armored vehicle for the time. Its complement was only 5 dismounts, though as far as German doctrine went, this was a half squad, or troop. The reasoning behind this design was the German doctrine around infantry vehicles being different than most others, as they did not pursue the battle taxi approach, preferring a far more aggressive employment of their infantry carriers. Related to that would be why the HS-30 was designed to be able to fight against anything other than a tank. This would include aerial targets such as helicopters and, at least probably not the newest jets, with its main gun being able to elevate to 70 degrees, which was very unusual at the time. For all the promise this vehicle showed, it had some significant issues. First and foremost was its design. It had some pretty significant problems with reliability, and these would take years to fix. Hispano-Suiza also didn't have the ability to actually make them in the kinds of numbers that the Bundeswehr required, which is why that first 1,000 was built by Leyland Motors. There was also the issue of a considerable amount of political involvement and corruption, which resulted in things such as bribes being paid to politicians, and companies being given advanced notice of design requirements. And by companies, I mean Hispano-Suiza. There were also some other design flaws in the vehicle. For example, there wasn't a particularly elegant way of dismounting, hence why the man on the left, in the picture on the top, is either going for a very dramatic and action hero dismount, or a very painful dismount. Up for you to interpret from the image there. Now, there may be some objections to my use of this as a IFV predating the BMP, as there are some sources that will refer to it as an APC. Now, the distinction between APCs, armored personnel carriers, and IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles, is not necessarily clear and is usually doctrinally dependent. So I will use German, or in this case West German, doctrine and design. The Marder 1, which everyone agrees is an IFV, had a complement of 6, one more than the HS-30, so as far as its transportation role fills the same niche. It is also armed with a 20mm cannon, although it's not the same cannon. Its front is slightly better protected, and its sides are slightly worse protected, but most relevant is when the Marder 1 entered service, it directly replaced the HS-30 in Panzergrenadier formations. Thus, as far as I am concerned, as the Marder 1, an IFV, was a direct replacement in the same units, for the same role, organized according to the same doctrine, then the HS-30 must be an IFV, and thus is an IFV predating the BMP. But the Germans weren't alone. Arguably, the French also beat the Soviets to the design of an IFV. The AMX VCI would start production in 1957 and would build about 3,000. They would be developed off of the AMX-13 light tank, a fairly common origin story for many lightly armored French vehicles at the time. Originally, it carried 10 dismounts and was armed with machine gun. However, later production versions would have 20mm guns. thus creating the AMX VCI M56, the M56 being the designation for the autocannon turret, and this would arguably make them IFVs. However, as far as whether this predates the BMP or not, I don't know. It's plausible, but I couldn't find any source that specifically stated when production of the autocannon version began. It is another interesting note that the AMX VCI was actually the vehicle that the HS-30 was competing against for those Bundeswehr contracts. So yeah, there was a time period in which, had history gone slightly differently, one of the primary arms suppliers of Germany would have been France, which is certainly an interesting historical event, but it also wasn't just the Germans and the French. The Austrian 4K-4FA would start production in 1961, 5 years before the BMP-1, and they would produce about 450 of these, of a pretty wide variety of variants. Now, most of these would also be armed with machine guns, thus would be considered armored personnel carriers. But the Grenadier variant, also known as the G2, would be armed with a 20mm gun. But unlike the AMX VCI, this was a production variant from the beginning, although it certainly wasn't the most common. That would be the machine gun variant. So, whether you wish to consider this as a IFV variant of an APC, not a true IFV, you can go ahead with that, but at the very least, it's another nation that was fiddling around with the concept and actually producing vehicles according to the concept of an IFV prior to the fielding of the BMP-1. And this vehicle actually has a far more extensive legacy than you may think. It was originally manufactured by Österreichische Feuerwerke. I hope I'm vaguely close to the actual pronunciation. In 1970, this company would be purchased by Steyr Daimler Puch AG. And that's important for the legacy of this vehicle because that company is half of the partnership behind Ascod. And if you'll pardon the diversion into the somewhat more modern, Ascod is a pretty interesting place. Ascod stands for the Austrian-Spanish Cooperation Development, and the original vehicles it would produce would be the Spanish Pizarro and the Austrian Ulan. Absolutely respectable modern infantry fighting vehicles with some differences between them, primarily being the engine. However, it would actually have some pretty famous descendants that people may be more familiar with, that being the British Ajax, a fairly direct descendant, although the Ajax program is unfortunately hampered by being a modern British program, and the British defense sector is well past its prime. The other is the American M10 Booker, whose primary issues are arguments about what exactly it is, an argument I will leave to people considerably more familiar with contemporary American doctrine, organization, and terminology. A country that for most does not get nearly enough love, and for some gets way too much love. The Swedes, with their Panzerbandwagen 301. Now, production of this would start in 1961, and they'd build about 200 of these. These were always considered to be an interim vehicle, and they were built on the chassis of the Stridswagen M41, a tank that the Swedes had in inventory but was considered fully obsolete by the start of the 1960s. This tank was a licensed production of the Skoda TNH tank, also known as the Swedish export version of the Skoda light tank model 1938, more well known as the Panzer 38T. How's that for a vehicle genealogy? Their original armament would also be interesting, as it was a Bofors 20mm L70 gun, taken from decommissioned Saab 21 jets. This is a fascinating vehicle, and would start the Cold War Swedish trend of very curved designs. Its complement would be 8 dismounts of infantry, and it would be replaced, in 1966, by the Panzerbandwagen 302. And I do apologize if that pronunciation is off, but I'll kind of default more to German. They'd build about 350 of these, and yes, entering production in 1966 does mean that Sweden was replacing its first generation of infantry fighting vehicle with its second generation the same year that the Soviets introduced the BMP. It would be armed with a Hispano-Suizo 804 20mm autocannon, and its protection would be rated against small arms from all angles, and at least from 50 cal from the front. I couldn't find a source that specifically stated what it was rated against, but it is thicker than the sides and is more heavily sloped. So it is reasonable to assume it's 50 cal fire, possibly 20 mil, but I'd be uncomfortable just making that assertion. It would retain the same complement of 8 dismounts, and despite, like its predecessor, being quite the adorable little IFV, it would be replaced by the CV-90, one of the meanest IFVs of the modern world, notable for many reasons, including its gun. Because you see, the Swedes looked at the 20mm and thought, well, we've had that for 2 generations, so we should go with something a bit bigger. I see some people are going with a 25mm, but that's not enough of an upgrade. The Soviets have gone with a 30mm, but we're already going big, so why not go all the way? Thus ushering the return of the Bofors 40mm autocannon. And though it's not the same gun that would earn its fame during the Second World War as being a gun just strapped onto any available space throughout the US Navy and the Royal Navy, it is that weapon's direct descendant. So apparently the Swedes just genetically like 40mm autocannons. Or at very least the designers at Bofors do. And hey, at this point the Swedes have had a 40mm Bofors in service for over a century, so why stop? But having covered several other nations and how they had IFVs before the Soviets had the BMP doesn't look nearly as revolutionary as it did at the start, but it does have some things unique to it. Specifically this, the turret, or at least the turret's weapons. You see, all other IFVs had an autocannon, but the BMP-1 had that 73mm low-velocity smoothbore, which it would seem that the Soviets considered a misstep, as the BMP-2 would have a 30mm autocannon, thus putting it more in line with all of its contemporaries. But they'd then bring the large-caliber low-pressure cannons back in the form of the 100mm rifled gun on the BMP-3, which would also have a 30mm autocannon, so presumably they saw advantages to both and decided, why not both? And yes, it was Soviet designers, because though the BMP-3 is thought of as a Russian Federation vehicle, it was at the very last stages of design and testing as the Soviet Union fell. So it was developed by the Soviets, built by the Russians, if you wish to look at it in that way. But that's actually not what was special. What was special was the Malyutka, because not only was ATGMs a new weapon, but they were a rare weapon, but not on the BMP-1. Every single vehicle had Malyutkas. This was a new technology that was being embraced at a scale in the Soviet Union no one else was. And you can see that that was the design feature of the BMP the rest of the world looked at and went, we need that. Because before the BMP-1, as you may have noticed, none of those other vehicles had ATGMs. After the BMP-1, ATGMs would be very common on IFVs, because it granted a long-ranged anti-tank capability that they just weren't capable of. And because ATGMs, especially at the time, were pretty bulky and inconvenient to move around, they weren't really man-portable. So, because your dismounts would fight closely with their transportation as part of the whole doctrine behind IFVs, the IFV would grant that kind of anti-tank firepower to their infantry. Yes, early ATGMs had some pretty significant drawbacks, but it was there. Previous to the BMP-1, ATGMs had been considered a specialist piece of equipment. It would be a company or even battalion level asset. With the BMP-1, it became a squad level asset. And once that kind of firepower was so widely distributed within the Soviet military, everyone had to respond. And so they had to rapidly proliferate their use of ATGMs as well. So, was the BMP-1 revolutionary? Kind of. Just not for the reasons that are commonly attributed to it. I hope this video has shed a little bit of light on some of the less known vehicles of the early and mid-Cold War. I'm still blown away by the growth that the channel has had over the last few weeks, and I'm happy to see that quite a few of you have stuck around. Next week, if everything goes according to plan, will be the big week. It will be the introduction to the war game for which this channel was created. I hope to see you all then. Bye-bye.